day, everybody. My name is Dennis Collier, and for the last 11 winter semesters, I have taught a course at the University of Toronto called Nutrition, Athletics, Performance, and Behavior. And on October the 15th of this year, 2025, the Nutritional Sciences Student Association were kind enough to do me the honor to invite me to come do a talk for their group. Now, the original plan was to record that lecture live and repost the live version. Not surprisingly, the technology failed me and the recording was no good. So I'm going to re-record it here and now. It really is a small miracle, folks, that any of these videos ever get produced, considering my gross incompetence in the domain of technology. Needless to say, the students were very accommodating. They let me choose whatever kind of topic I wanted to talk about. So I thought to myself, what could be the most impactful message that I could deliver to these students in a half an hour of talking to them? And I said, the title of my talk is going to be The Single Healthiest Thing. In other words, what is the single thing that you can do with the 24 hours you've been given on this day on planet Earth to maximize your health or physical fitness? And I thought this topic would serve beautifully as kind of a prequel to my actual course, because in my course, I don't talk too much about this thing that I think is the single healthiest thing that a person can do. So I'm framing this talk as the prequel to my course. Just as a fun fact, I did a quick survey of some of the younger people in the audience as to what they thought were some of the best prequels of all time, and I was somewhat, I have to say, dismayed by their answer. They suggested things like Star Wars. Someone even suggested The Hobbit. But I think we're going to aim for a little bit higher standard than that, because everyone knows some of the greatest prequels of all time. Things like The Godfather Part 2 or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's the kind of standard that I'm aiming for here in this talk. And like many good prequels do, I'm going to start today with a little snippet from the main show. What you are looking at is one of the very first slides that I always use in lecture one of my course. And I start right with the most high level stuff, the most tantalizing of questions, the most philosophical of all questions. I asked the group, what's more important, nutrition versus exercise? Now, there's no question, nobody doubts that they are two of the most important modifiable determinants of health that there is, namely the food you choose to put in your body on any given day versus the amount of exercise that you get. But people usually sit on the fence and they hem and they haw and they leave it at that. They say they're both important, and they are, but I like to be provocative. And I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to suggest that there is an answer to this question, which of the two is more important. And the answer is usually not what the majority of the group thinks it is. Because if we are adhering to the principles of evidence-based practice, I feel very strongly that the answer to the question is exercise is more important than nutrition. What do you mean by important? You fill in the blank, whatever you think, whether it be avoiding disease, whether it be optimizing your performance in a sport, whether it be creating the optimal physique that you wish to create. Exercise is the bigger driver of any of those things, based on the totality of scientific evidence available. Here's what I mean by that. If you were to combine two different piles, okay, of all the scientific evidence linking each of these two variables to those kind of outcomes, you'd have mountainous piles for both for nutrition and for exercise. But I strongly, strongly believe the bigger of the two piles of evidence would be in the corner of exercise. Now, there's also an excellent reason behind that, which is the second question that I asked my students after I've kind of crushed their dreams and made them question the direction of program they enrolled in. But the reason why exercise wins in this kind of an evidence-based analysis that I'm talking about is because of the second question, which of these two variables is more confusing? And the answer for that is overwhelmingly nutrition. More confusing, more complicated, to the point where after this question is asked in my course, I say, look, we got to unpack nutrition. There's like 33 hours of lecture coming where we have to unpack the role of nutrition. And so, as a prequel to all that, what I want to do is spend the next half an hour or so explaining what is the single healthiest thing. You already know it's something in the domain of exercise, but before we're done here, I'm going to give you an even more specific answer. And so to begin, I think it would be helpful to establish some definitions. And I think it's helpful to illustrate these definitions using the visual aid of a pyramid, because at the base of the pyramid is the broadest definition. As you go up these 4 rows, the definitions get narrower and narrower. Let's start at the foundation of physical activity. So everything you see in this pyramid does meet the definition of physical activity. But as we go up, we get more and more specific. Let me first talk about the second row in the pyramid, exercise. I would define exercise as being distinct from physical activity in that it is physical activity that you deliberately undertake for the purposes of benefiting your health or physical fitness or sports performance. It all counts as physical activity. It's just more deliberate. And I can break this down even further for you with the use of some very well-accepted standard recommendations. There are several very well-respected organizations that give the recommended dose as being 150 minutes per week. But here's how I would break this down, if I may be so bold, in the distinguishing between, is it exercise or is it physical activity? I think in order to gain the most benefit, what a person should aim for is 150 minutes per week of exercise. And your physical activity is considered to be a bonus on top of that. I literally just had a personal real-life example that illustrates this particular distinction very, very well, in that I just walked my daughter to school. 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back. No question. This is physical activity, but I'm not counting it towards my 150 minutes per week of exercise. How come? Well, the purpose of me walking her to school was to get her to school. I wasn't doing it to benefit my health or physical fitness. I humbly believe that including those kind of things in your 150 minutes per week is setting the bar too low. I think it is a very, very defensible message to do the most good for the most number of people with regards to their health and well-being, to do your best to try in your week to find 150 minutes, not just of physical activity, but of deliberate exercise. And the rationale, I think, for this is very, very sound in that this 150 minutes is by no means a magic number. And in fact, there's an awful lot of reason to think more is better. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there's a very, very minor segment of the population where something called overtraining is relevant. But again, I'm talking big picture, message with the best possible impact on the most number of people. And I believe that would be aim to get in your 150 minutes per week of deliberate, structured exercise. And then as the foundation to all that, you're also getting lots of good physical activity, like walking your daughter to school in the morning. So now, as we get up to the third row of the pyramid here, I got to be honest and say we're really splitting hairs about what's best, because if you cover your bases of what I just said in the first 2 rows, 150 minutes per week of exercise of any type that you like, and on top of that, you're living like a physically active lifestyle, you've already put yourself into an enormously beneficial position compared to people that are not getting any exercise or physical activity. But for the keeners of the world, the kind who listened to my presentation on October the 15th, or might be watching this video, it's interesting to now debate further, well, what's the single best kind of exercise that you can get? And I'm going to, again, humbly put forth that we all should find a way to work into our exercise regime something called resistance training. Okay, we're only a few minutes in, and I've already answered the question. What is the single healthiest thing you can possibly do? It is engage in this modality of exercise called resistance training. And for the rest of the talk, that's what I'm going to explain why that is. But if I may take one more little bit of poetic license, there's one more small top of the pyramid left here, and it's called power training. I'm going to put forth the argument as to why maybe, just maybe, you want to incorporate that more nuanced, more niche type of resistance training into your workout as well. Power training. I'm very, very partial to this myself, and is best illustrated by the girl there at the top of the pyramid who I interviewed this time last year, Canada's first gold medalist in the sport of Olympic weightlifting, Christine Girard. Okay, just so we're using precise language and there's no confusion, I want to give you 3 more definitions. The first one, what does it even mean, resistance training? Okay, a few criteria. First one, it's got to be deliberately structured exercise, usually in our modern world today. And quite simply, it is when your brain compels your muscles to contract against an external force. A question always comes up, how much is enough to qualify as resistance? Usually this is quantified in terms of repetitions. So for example, if you can press the weight 65 times, you've probably ventured into something that is no longer resistance training. And that might be fair enough to do reps, but I think another good way to look at it, because it includes more things, more types of exercise that I want to include in here, is the mnemonic device of, I will fatigue here in seconds, not minutes. And time under tension, by the way, is another totally valid way to assess this. But my idea is to look at it as the activity is going to cause me to fatigue to the point where I'm no longer putting forth the same force that I was, and that will occur in a matter of seconds, not minutes. There's a bunch of subcategories that fall under resistance training. So for example, strength training. I wouldn't call resistance training strength training. Strength training to me is something more specific. And to use Christine Girard as the example again, there's different types of strength training. Her sport is called weightlifting, or more descriptively, Olympic-style weightlifting. There's a separate sport called powerlifting, and much to the chagrin of everybody involved in the sports science aspect of this, Olympic-style weightlifting actually involves more power than does powerlifting, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Certainly both involve strength, and they both involve a little bit of power, but one involves more power than the other, and it's Christine's sport, Olympic-style weightlifting. And here is that slide, and what you are looking at, I'm very proud to share this. This is my handwriting from grade 10 physics with Mr. Graham. He taught us this. I made a cheat sheet for the terms we had to know. Who would have thought all those years later it would still be useful to me? And this is not exercise science at the time. This is just purely and simply the laws of physics, but it applies here very, very aptly. We even measure it in watts, as anyone knows who gets on a stationary cycle or a rowing erg, and it calculates for you how many watts of power you are producing. But the key of this definition, it's all about the bottom word there on the page, time. Namely, it involves a measure of speed, how fast you can do a certain amount of work. And even the term work, which we use in everyday parlance, has a definition in physics, which is useful here. So in other words, let's break it down like in the weight room. You have a certain mass. You want to accelerate that at a certain rate, and you move the mass a certain distance. Divide that all by time, how fast you do it. Folks, this is what it means to lift or exercise with power. And here's the third and final definition. Every first-year kinesiology student is taught a handful of fundamental principles of exercise science. This is one of them, the principle of specificity, which means the body only adapts to the specific stimulus that you place upon it, whether it be the muscles involved, whether it be the systems involved, whether it be the neural pathways you're trying to develop. Your body responds in a very, very specific way to the training to which you subject it. Another disclaimer moving forward. In the scientific literature, it's actually quite hard to tease out when are they referring to what I'll call power training. They use different terms: power training, impact training, speed training. So because it's so hard to tease that out, I go back to, I reiterate my answer to the question, what's the single healthiest thing you can possibly do? The answer is resistance training. Again, a mountain, as I'm going to show you, of scientific evidence suggests that. But again, I think there's a niche for power training too. And as I say, it's kind of hard to tease out of that body of literature. Speaking of that mountain of evidence, here is just a small sample of the kind of references that you're going to find illustrating the enormous benefit of engaging in resistance training, to the point where there's so many of these studies. Most of what you're doing is you're finding meta-analysis of multiple studies, or very large prospective cohort studies that came out last year, 28 countries. We are talking subjects numbering in the millions, tens of millions of people all over this earth who have been scientifically studied and shown, guess what? The act of engaging in resistance training, the kind of stuff that I just explained what it is, in the kind of time frame that I've explained what it is, leads to improvements in the quantity of life and the quality of life. So in other words, you're less likely to die, and the life that you do lead, you can do way more stuff. Now let's get into some of the reasons as to why that is. Keeping in mind the principle that we just talked about of specificity. And if you were to ask someone on the street, hey, what do you think happens to a person who lifts weights? This is not rocket science. I think that person would say to you, if you lift weights, you're going to get stronger, and you're going to get more muscles. And so although that is certainly well appreciated, I really don't think the general public fully appreciates how important it is to be strong. What if I was to say how strong you are at squeezing a hand grip dynamometer is on a very short list of things that are the most predictive of whether or not you're going to die. I keep talking about the mountain of evidence that exists for this. Getting studies for this is like shooting fish in a barrel. They're so plentiful. I chose this one just because it came out last year, 2024. It's N. Haynes data, big study, 10,000 adults, 20 years of age or older, the middle-aged people on average, like myself. I'll just cut to the main finding there. The main finding of this study was that decreased grip strength in adults was associated with an increased risk of all-cause mortality. Let me see if I can make this a little bit clearer. So what they do in these studies very often, so you get your score, how strong you are, okay? Then they rank the subjects from the strongest to the lowest. And in this particular study, if you were strong enough whereby you found yourself in the highest quartile, okay, versus the lowest quartile, so the top 25% of strongest people versus the bottom 25% weakest people, there's like a twofold higher hazard ratio for all-cause mortality for the weakest people versus the strongest people. And this is just one study of many, many, many like this. What about the second thing that our average Joe there on the street shouted out as being a specific consequence of engaging in resistance training? What about just the total amount of muscle tissue that a person might have on their body? Is that predictive of anything? Is that important? Oh yeah. To the point where there is a disease named for having suboptimal amounts of skeletal muscle tissue. Now, the developments in this field have been coming fast and furious in recent years. This is why I'm showing you this study that came out last year, 2024, which is about work done by an entity called the Global Leadership Initiative in Sarcopenia, which was convened because for years and years, this was really a disease with no definition. It was always about the inadequate amounts of skeletal muscle tissue, but research and recommendations were hampered by the fact there was no consensus definition. So that's one of the main objectives that this group is tasked to do. It used to be that the whole condition of sarcopenia was kind of tightly married to aging. Now, I think what you're going to find in the literature forthcoming is that it's not necessarily age dependent, and you can be sarcopenic, aka not have adequate amounts of muscle tissue at any age. But that being said, there can be no question that the aging process is not kind to this physiology. I've listed some numbers here. Some of these specifics are up for debate, but let's just go with this in general. Once you get to around age 30, there's going to be some fairly substantial impediments you're going to have to overcome. Regarding skeletal muscle tissue, the rate of decrease at around that age is about 0.8% per year. And it also bears mentioning that there's a preferential loss of the type 2 muscle fibers, which is your fast twitch muscle fibers, which, by the way, put those two together. If you ever wondered, why is it that all these pro athletes are retiring, or at least they're starting to think about how many years do I have left once they hit 30 or mid-30s, I think that's a big, big reason. You're just not as quick as you once were. And also muscular strength, that other very, very important thing, predictive thing that we talked about, can begin decreasing at this age, maybe by about 2 to 3% per year. So if you're keeping score there, I didn't quantify speed loss, but the rate in which you lose these things, first of all, is what you lose speed. Secondly, you lose strength. And then you see the actual percent of skeletal muscle tissue loss is the lowest. You can hold on to that actually for a little bit longer, at least compared to your speed and your strength. And if you're wondering how all that bad stuff translates to real world outcomes, here's another paper just came out earlier this year by the same group, the Global Leadership Initiative in Sarcopenia, where they outline some of the adverse health outcomes of this disease: increased mortality, diminished quality of life, heightened risk of falls, fractures, hospitalizations, reduced independent activities of daily living, etc., etc., etc. And in case I have not been clear, to repeat myself one more time, in accordance with the fundamental principles of exercise physiology, what is the technique that we know is our best defense against decreased skeletal muscle mass and decreased strength? That is resistance training, just a couple times a week. The single healthiest thing you can do, folks. Now, in the last few minutes here, let me try to make the case for that peak of the pyramid, that subgenre of resistance training. Let me make the case as to why within your resistance training you might also maybe want to try to incorporate power training. But first, in the interest of adhering to all the important stages of the scientific method and showing you why this method is the best method that we have for determining the truth, let me tell you this story. So this global leadership initiative in sarcopenia did in fact consider whether muscle power should be part of the conceptual definition of sarcopenia. If you look at the paper, they have a bunch of these kind of statements, right? And they evaluate them all. How it works is they have a Delphi group, or like an expert group, and they all evaluate each of these statements. That was the statement as written regarding muscle power. And the group voted not to include muscle power in the conceptual definition of sarcopenia. It was close. I mean, they all thought it was useful, but it did not meet the threshold, didn't meet the criteria of acceptance as per the scientific process. Despite the fact there is a body of scientific evidence that looks like this. And again, these are not just singular studies mostly, but they are studies of studies, systematic reviews and meta-analysis that try to tease out differences in power training versus conventional resistance training. As I mentioned earlier, it's a bit tricky to do this, but it seems like, I don't know, there's a lot of authors that when you do this, you find that, my goodness, there's a pretty good benefit of engaging in power training, which again, to review our Physics 101 definition, is not just strength, but the muscle's ability to perform work over time. In other words, not just strength, but strength with speed. Now, at this point, the students that were in the room on October 15th began asking some very good questions. One girl who I had obviously gotten very intrigued about the whole idea raised her hand and she said, okay, I get resistance training is number one. And then above that, there's like a niche further about power training. But she said, how can I do power training? Like you gave the example of Christine Girard. And she said, I can't do Olympic style weightlifting. To which I said, sure you can. No, all jokes aside, what she's getting at is that she can't do Olympic style weightlifting today because she has to learn how to do it. These are, no question, they're complicated. They're the most complicated things you can do in a weight room. You have to be taught the art of Olympic style weightlifting. But why not do that? Why not invest the time? Find a club, find a qualified coach, and spend some of your time training on the Olympic lifts. But let's say that is just not going to be your cup of tea. That's okay. There's not one size fits all in exercise. There's a bunch of ways you could do things that meet the definition of power training. Like, for example, there is a nearly infinite number of exercises that would fall in the category of plyometrics that you could do that meet this definition. So things like box jumps, one-legged jumps or skips. How about a broad jump? Think about a broad jump. Take your body weight, however much that is, 100 whatever pounds, and you jump as far as you can in one bound. And then how many times do you think you can do that before the distance that you're bounding it's not what it was on rep number 1? It ain't going to be minutes, let me tell you that. Some people like kettlebells. That's an implement that lends itself to power training. Or if you insist on doing things that are a little more orthodox, you could just do the sprinting. And I've spoken a few times about the value I think sprinting presents to the human anatomy. In the context of our discussion here now, taking that mass, whatever it is, accelerating it as fast as you can over a certain distance. And if you can't run, there's ways for sure you can do sprint training for power training that are more inconspicuous. How about go on your stationary cycle and you just pedal that thing as hard as you can? Or the rowing erg again, they literally tell you how many watts you produce. Watts is the measure of power. One of my absolute personal favorite things. I bought this a few years ago for like $30. It's called a slam ball. Actually, I bet I have that slam ball out there. Now, if you live in the city of Toronto and you're lucky enough, on a few days in the summer, you might be able to go to any one of the numerous fields in this city and see some crazy old dude with wild gray hair taking this thing and throw it down the field, sprint after it, pick it up, throw it again. There's all kinds of ways you can throw it. That's power training. Now, the last very good question a student asked is, are these types of power training dangerous? I might not go so far as to use the word dangerous, but the student is absolutely onto something. Let's put it this way. They are riskier, I think is fair to say, than other types of exercise. But what I also said to the student, there's two things actually I wanted to impress upon them. Number one, I deliberately chose to talk about power training to that group. How come? Because they're a bunch of 20-year-old university students, early 20s, no less. And if there is a group that is the least likely to have an injury result from this type of training, it would be the group that I talked to that day. So look, for sure, let's cover all our bases and say it's prudent to make sure you're medically cleared before you do any type of exercise training. But on that note, the second and final point I really wanted to impress upon them, like all these studies that I showed would indicate, man, oh man, you're talking about risk and danger. I think there's a pretty big risk of not exercising toward your long-term health and well-being. And so that was my presentation on October the 15th, 2025 to the U of T's Nutritional Sciences Student Association. To conclude and to summarize for one final time, what is the single healthiest thing? The answer, as I see it, is choosing to engage in this beautiful, beautiful thing called resistance training. And then, if you wanted to go one step further, I might investigate this idea of engaging in an even more niche and nuanced style of resistance training that might have some pretty impressive benefits, that being power training. Okay, that's it for me. Good day, everybody.